He was called Brother Number One, the man who promised utopia but delivered a nightmare. Pol Pot's regime turned Cambodia into a land of death, where the cries of the starving and the silence of mass graves echoed across the fields. Nearly 2 million lives were erased beneath his vision of purity. Yet even tyrants cannot escape time, and in the end, Pol Pot was not brought down by armies, nor by courts, but by betrayal, fear, and the jungle itself. By the late 1990s, the world's most wanted man was no longer the iron-fisted ruler of Phnom Penh. He was an exile, frail and paranoid, hidden in the tangled forests of Cambodia, guarded by the remnants of a broken army. His body was weak, his power shattered, but his name still carried the weight of horror. And then, one night, it ended. A death shrouded in mystery, a heart that failed, or a poison swallowed in desperation, or a silencing carried out by the very men who once served him. His corpse was burned quickly, without ceremony, in a jungle clearing, a dictator consumed by flames, his ashes scattering into the soil he once drenched in blood. This is the story of the horrific death of Pol Pot. Part 1. The Jungle Exile. A fallen dictator in hiding. The world remembered him as the butcher of Cambodia. Brother Number One, the man who had ordered the emptying of cities, who had forced millions into the rice fields, who had watched his people starve and die in the name of a twisted dream. Yet by the late 1980s and into the 1990s, Pol Pot was no longer a towering figure in a capital city. He was an old man, frail and hunted, swallowed by the very jungle that had once sheltered his revolution. His empire was gone, his comrades had turned into enemies, and his throne was reduced to a rickety wooden chair in a rotting hut deep in the borderlands. For decades, the jungle had been Pol Pot's sanctuary. It was here, in the shadows of bamboo groves and under the hum of insects, that the Khmer Rouge had waged its guerrilla war. The forest had hidden supply lines, swallowed entire camps, and muffled the screams of prisoners. It was both fortress and graveyard. But now, in the twilight of his life, the jungle had become his prison. The hut where he lived was crude, a skeleton of wood and thatch, damp from monsoon rains and reeking of mold. The air was heavy with the smell of smoke from cooking fires and the acrid scent of medicine. His wife, younger than him, moved silently through the shadows, tending to him with the loyalty of one who knew no other world. A daughter, still a child, played in the dirt nearby, too young to understand that her father was not simply a sick old man, but the most wanted war criminal alive. Pol Pot himself had changed little in appearance. He wore simple clothes, loose shirts and trousers, blending easily with the peasants around him. His face was pale, rounded, with soft features that belied the cruelty of his reign. To the unknowing eye, he might have appeared harmless, another grandfather fading into the twilight of his years. But those who guarded him, those who still whispered his name with a mixture of fear and devotion, knew the truth. This was no ordinary exile. This was Brother Number One, and his shadow stretched across every bamboo grove and forgotten clearing. He lived carefully, always hidden. The Vietnamese army had driven the Khmer Rouge from Phnom Penh in 1979, but Pol Pot had not disappeared. He retreated to the Thai-Cambodian border, building new bases in the jungle, surviving on foreign aid, funneled secretly through the Cold War's tangled politics. The world had turned its attention elsewhere, first to Afghanistan, then to the crumbling of the Soviet Union, and in that chaos, Pol Pot endured, invisible but alive, plotting the impossible dream of returning to power. Life in exile, however, was no victory. The Khmer Rouge fractured. Once loyal comrades grew weary of the endless struggle. Some surrendered to the Cambodian government, trading their weapons for peace. Others turned on each other, carving the movement into bitter factions. In the camps, food was scarce, medicine scarcer still. Malaria haunted the soldiers. Children who had been born in the jungle knew nothing of cities or schools. They lived and died beneath the canopy of trees, their futures consumed by a war that had lost all meaning. Pol Pot remained at the center of it, clinging to control through fear and manipulation. He spoke softly, in the same calm, almost gentle voice that had once charmed intellectuals and students. But behind his words was the same ruthless will, the same paranoia that had condemned millions. He trusted no one fully. Guards were rotated, commanders kept in check, rivals quietly sidelined or removed. Even in exile, he ruled like a king of shadows, convinced that history would one day vindicate him. Yet time eroded his fortress. The Cold War ended, and with it, the streams of foreign support. The world no longer had use for a jungle insurgent who promised to fight communism or destabilize Cambodia's neighbors. Thailand, once a reluctant patron, began to tighten its border, eager to rid itself of the burden. China, his greatest ally, shifted its gaze to trade and diplomacy, leaving him isolated. His army dwindled, his weapons rusted, and the jungle pressed closer, reclaiming what little remained of his realm. The man who had once ordered executions in the thousands now lived surrounded by whispers. His followers still addressed him with reverence, but behind his back, doubt grew. Younger commanders, who had never seen the heights of his power, questioned his vision. They had been born into war and had grown tired of fighting for a dream that no longer existed. For them, survival mattered more than ideology, and for Pol Pot, this was the greatest betrayal, not by foreign enemies, but by the children of his own revolution. His health, too, betrayed him. Age crept through his bones. He suffered from heart problems, high blood pressure, and the lingering effects of malaria. His once sharp eyes dimmed. His steps grew slower. Some days he remained confined to his bed, staring out at the dripping leaves as rain hammered the roof. Yet even weakened, he clung to his pride. He never admitted defeat, never confessed to the mountains of corpses that bore his name. To those who asked, he claimed innocence. The deaths, he said, were accidents, mistakes of others, misfortunes of war. In his mind, he remained pure, a visionary misunderstood by the world, and so he stayed in the jungle, a ghost of power. News of his survival trickled through rumors and reports, each citing more myth than fact. To some Cambodians, he was already dead, a phantom haunting the borders. To others, he was the devil still at large, waiting to return. Mothers warned their children with his name. Soldiers cursed it in their camps. And in Phnom Penh, leaders watched nervously, fearful that the old tyrant might yet rise from the ashes. But in truth, Pol Pot's exile was a slow decay. The jungle that had once echoed with gunfire now carried only the buzz of insects and the coughs of sick soldiers. His hut, guarded by weary men with rusting rifles, was less a palace than a cage. His words, once commands that shook a nation, carried weight only in the shrinking circle of loyalists, too frightened to abandon him. It was a cruel irony. The man who had emptied cities, who had sought to erase families and traditions, now lived as a recluse, surrounded only by family and ritual. His wife fetched him water. His daughter's laughter echoed in the mud. His guards muttered stories of his greatness by the fire, though even they began to doubt. The jungle, patient and eternal, seemed to mock him. The leaves grew thick around his hut, vines curling over the roof, as if the earth itself was preparing to swallow him. And still, he dreamed. Late at night, as storms rolled over the borderlands, Pol Pot spoke of returning to Phnom Penh, of rebuilding the movement, of reclaiming what had been lost. He believed, or forced himself to believe, that the revolution had not died. He was not a fugitive, not a defeated tyrant. He was a leader waiting for his moment. In his mind, history had not ended. It had only paused. But the truth was clear to all who looked upon him. Pol Pot was a relic, trapped in a prison of jungle and memory. His exile was not heroic resistance. It was slow suffocation, a man shrinking into the shadows of the very trees that had once sheltered his power. The dictator who had sought to control every heartbeat of a nation was now at the mercy of mosquitoes, of disease, of betrayal. The jungle had devoured kingdoms before, swallowing temples, palaces, and cities whole. Now it was devouring a man, the most feared man Cambodia had ever known. His exile was not freedom, it was the beginning of his end. Part 2: Whispers of Betrayal, Trials, Guards, and the Collapse of Power. The jungle has no mercy. It devours not only the weak, but also the powerful who linger too long. By the mid-1990s, Pol Pot was learning that lesson more intimately than any enemy could have taught him. Once, he had ordered purges from the throne of Phnom Penh. Once, his voice had decided the fate of millions. Now, those same shadows crept back upon him. He was surrounded not by enemies from the outside, but by whispers in the camp, whispers of betrayal, whispers of trial, whispers that brother number one was no longer untouchable. The Khmer Rouge was rotting from the inside. Years of endless fighting had drained the movement of its purpose. The war against the Vietnamese-backed government in Phnom Penh had dragged on like a wound that refused to heal. Soldiers bled, commanders defected, and the world outside had stopped caring. Aid from China and sympathetic networks had dwindled. Thailand was tired of a rebel army festering along its border. Even within the bamboo clearings where Pol Pot's men lit their nightly fires, morale was evaporating like smoke in the wet season. For the young fighters, many born long after 1975, the revolution was not an ideal. It was hunger, disease, and gunfire without end. They had never walked the streets of Phnom Penh in triumph. They knew only the jungle, the mud, the malaria, the constant retreat. For them, Pol Pot was a pale, aging figure whose grand words could not fill their bellies. His myth was fading, but the old leader still believed. He spoke of betrayal in the capital, of foreign enemies plotting Cambodia's destruction, of the need to cleanse and rebuild once more. The same words he had once used to unleash death upon cities now rang hollow. The commanders nodded, but behind their eyes, the fire was gone. The breaking point came in 1997. Pol Pot, frail but determined, ordered the execution of Son Sen once, his loyal defense minister, a comrade from the early revolutionary days. Son Sen had begun to show signs of wavering, perhaps even considering negotiations with the Cambodian government. To Pol Pot, that was unforgivable. Betrayal was a cancer, and like all cancers, it must be cut out. Son Sen, his wife, and several family members were executed in cold blood. But this was not Phnom Penh in 1977. Where Pol Pot's word was law and obedience unquestioned. This was the decaying jungle, where commanders were weary and soldiers suspicious. Instead of consolidating his power, the murder of Son Sen tore the last shreds of loyalty apart. The act horrified, even hardened, Khmer Rouge fighters. It was not seen as strength, it was seen as madness. The whispers grew louder. Pol Pot had lost his mind. For the first time, brother number one was vulnerable. His closest commanders, men who had fought under his banner for decades, turned against him. They saw that his paranoia and cruelty would drag them all into oblivion. They began to murmur of a trial in Phnom Penh, not under international law, but a jungle tribunal, staged by his own comrades. Pol Pot, the architect of purges, would now face one himself. The preparations were quiet but deliberate. A bamboo hut was cleared. Guards were doubled, but not for Pol Pot's protection, for his containment. Soldiers were summoned from different sectors. Some came reluctantly, still loyal to the old leader. Others came eagerly, sensing history shifting beneath their feet. The air in the camp grew heavy. Everyone knew something unprecedented was about to happen. When the day arrived, the jungle seemed to fall silent. Cicadas and birdsong faded beneath the tension. Pol Pot, frail and dressed in his plain peasant clothes, was brought before the gathering. The sight was surreal. For decades, no one had dared raise their voice against him. His commands had meant life or death. Yet now he sat on a wooden chair, surrounded not by enemies but by his own comrades, awaiting judgment. The tribunal was less a trial than a declaration. Commanders accused him of treachery, of murdering Son Sen without reason, of dragging the Khmer Rouge into ruin. They spoke openly, their voices rising with long-suppressed anger. Soldiers who had once bowed before him now muttered in agreement. For the first time, Pol Pot was not the master of the room. He was the accused. He defended himself calmly, even softly. His voice retained its old, almost teacherly tone. He claimed he had acted to protect the revolution, that Son Sen's betrayal would have destroyed them. He insisted that his vision was still pure, that history would vindicate him. But his words no longer carried the same weight. The spell was broken. The man who had once convinced an entire movement to slaughter its own people now found his rhetoric falling flat among his own guards. The verdict was swift. Pol Pot was declared guilty not of genocide, not of the mountains of skulls that filled Cambodia's killing fields, but of betrayal to his comrades. His sentence was not death, not exile beyond the jungle. Instead, it was humiliation. He was to be placed under house arrest, stripped of his power, guarded like a criminal by the very soldiers who had once carried out his orders. When the announcement was made, Pol Pot sat in silence. Perhaps he realized then that his empire was gone, that his life had shrunk to a shack and a few guards. Perhaps he believed, as he always had, that it was a temporary setback, that destiny would one day restore him. No one could tell. His face, pale and round, betrayed nothing. From that moment on, he was a prisoner. His guards were young men who had grown up in the ruins of his war. They treated him with a strange mixture of fear and contempt. They brought him food, kept him alive, but watched his every move. At night, they whispered among themselves, mocking the once mighty leader, speculating on his crimes. Pol Pot, who had once been omnipotent, now listened to their whispers through the thin bamboo walls of his hut. The collapse of his authority rippled outward. News of the jungle trial spread quickly. The world, long uncertain whether Pol Pot still lived, suddenly had proof not only of his existence, but of his downfall. Journalists wrote of the bizarre spectacle. The tyrant, judged by his own army, condemned not for genocide, but for killing one of his own. International leaders, who had once struggled with how to capture him, watched in disbelief. The world had not defeated Pol Pot. His own shadows had. The jungle seemed to mock him. The monsoon rains returned, drenching his hut, soaking the paths where soldiers trudged with rifles slung over weary shoulders. Vines crept further up the bamboo walls. The nights were filled with the shrill calls of insects and the laughter of guards who no longer respected him. His world had shrunk to a few square meters, and beyond them, the realization that history was moving on without him. Yet Pol Pot never admitted defeat. To his family, he insisted that the tribunal was a farce, a misunderstanding. He still spoke of returning to power, of leading Cambodia once more. His daughter played near his feet, too young to understand that her father was no longer a leader, but a prisoner of his own revolution. His wife tended to him quietly, carrying food and medicine, her silence the only loyalty left to him. The man who had commanded cities now waited for bowls of rice delivered by guards half his age. The dictator who had ordered mass purges now feared the whispers outside his door. It was the collapse of power in its purest form, not by enemy armies or international courts, but by the erosion of belief. The Khmer Rouge had stopped believing in Pol Pot, and when belief dies, even the most ruthless tyrant becomes just another old man waiting for the end. In Phnom Penh, leaders watched the news with grim satisfaction. Hun Sen, once a Khmer Rouge defector himself, declared that Pol Pot's trial was a joke. He wanted the world to remember that true justice had not yet been served, that the man who had killed nearly 2 million people was still breathing in the jungle. But even Hun Sen must have realized the irony. The great dictator was now reduced to a guarded recluse, his voice silenced, not by international tribunals, but by his own broken movement. The jungle closed in around him. Days bled into nights. The whispers never ceased. Guards spoke of his crimes, of his weakness, of the futility of his dreams. To them, he was no longer brother number one. He was an old man with failing health, clinging to illusions, his reign reduced to ashes. The collapse was complete. The man who had once commanded absolute obedience now lived in fear of the whispers outside his door. And the whispers were growing louder. Part 3, The Last Breath, Death, Rumors, and a Nation's Ghosts. The jungle was quiet the night Pol Pot died. Not the silence of peace, but the suffocating hush that comes before a storm, when even the insects seem to know that something has shifted. April 15, 1998. It was the Cambodian New Year, a time when families lit incense for ancestors, when spirits of the dead were believed to walk among the living. But in a rotting hut near An Long Vin, the spirits that gathered were not those of gentle ancestors. They were the ghosts of a nation, summoned to watch brother number one take his final breath. By then Pol Pot was a shadow of a man. He was 72, though age had weathered him into someone older. His body had grown frail, his legs weak, his heart swollen with disease. Guards whispered that he rarely left his bed. His voice, once calm and commanding, had thinned into little more than a murmur. His face, round and deceptively gentle, looked sunken under the dim glow of a kerosene lamp. He was no longer feared as a tyrant, but pitied as an invalid. Yet even in his last days, he clung to illusions. He told visitors he would return to Phnom Penh. He believed or forced himself to believe that the Khmer Rouge would rise again, that history had paused only briefly and would soon swing back in his favor. But beyond the bamboo walls of his hut, reality had already sealed his fate. The Khmer Rouge was collapsing. Defections bled the movement dry. The Cambodian government, backed by foreign allies, tightened its noose, and Tarmok, the last warlord clinging to scraps of the revolution, knew that Pol Pot was no longer an asset, but a burden. That April, the final betrayal came. Tarmok, pressured by the inevitability of defeat, decided to hand Pol Pot over to international authorities. Word spread quickly. Brother number 1 would be delivered to face trial, not in a jungle tribunal this time, but before the eyes of the world. Justice, long denied, seemed suddenly within reach. Reporters swarmed to the border. Foreign governments prepared statements. Survivors of the killing fields, scattered across Cambodia and the diaspora, held their breath. Could it be true? Would the architect of their suffering finally stand trial? Inside his hut, Pol Pot received the news. Accounts differ of how he reacted. Some say he appeared calm, even resigned. Others whispered that he looked shaken, that for the first time in decades, fear flickered in his pale eyes. Whatever the truth, one fact remained certain. Within hours of learning he was to be handed over, Pol Pot was dead. The official story was simple. He had died of a heart attack in his sleep, his frail body finally surrendering to illness. Guards claimed they had found him lying on his bed, his face peaceful, as if he had drifted away without pain. But the timing was too precise, too convenient. Few believed it was natural. Rumors spread like wildfire. Some said he had taken poison, choosing death over humiliation. Others whispered that his loyalists had slipped him a lethal dose of medicine, sparing him the disgrace of capture. There were even those who suspected Ta Mok himself, fearing that a captured Pol Pot might expose secrets, had ordered the old man quietly silenced. The truth was lost in the smoke of that jungle night. The only certainty was this: Pol Pot had escaped the judgment of the living. When news of his death broke, the world reacted with disbelief. After decades of chasing his ghost through headlines and reports, after so many near misses and false sightings, Pol Pot was gone. Survivors of his regime felt cheated. There would be no trial, no day in court, no moment to look the butcher in the eye and hear him answer for the skulls that littered the earth. He had slipped away quietly, denying his victims even the satisfaction of seeing him condemned. The body was prepared in haste, wrapped in white sheets, placed on a crude bamboo bed. It was left in his hut for a brief vigil. His young daughter cried. His wife sat silently, her face a mask of grief and fear. Guards shuffled nervously, knowing that history itself was watching. Outside, villagers and soldiers gathered, not in mourning but in uneasy curiosity. The great dictator, who had once emptied cities, was now reduced to a corpse guarded by men who no longer believed in him. No state funeral awaited him, no marble tomb or golden urn. Instead, his body was carried to a shallow pit, laid atop a pile of old tires and scrap wood. Kerosene was poured, and the fire lit. Flames consumed the sheets, the skin, the flesh. Thick black smoke rose into the jungle sky, choking the air with the stench of burning rubber and human remains. The body of brother number 1, responsible for nearly 2 million deaths, was reduced to ash in a funeral fit not for a ruler but for a criminal hurried out of history. Photographs were taken. The world demanded proof that he was truly gone. Images of his pale corpse, eyes shut, mouth slightly agape, were printed in newspapers across the globe. Some Cambodians stared at the pictures in disbelief. Could this frail, lifeless old man really be the monster who had commanded their suffering? Could this husk truly be the one who had emptied Phnom Penh, who had ordered executions in the thousands, who had built fields of bones? The photographs did little to silence the rumors. Some insisted the body was a double, that Pol Pot had escaped once more into the jungle. Others believed his death was staged to protect him, that he had fled into hiding with loyalists. In the villages, in the diaspora, in whispers around the world, Pol Pot's death became another ghost story. The dictator who had erased history now left behind a death shrouded in uncertainty. But whether natural or poisoned, real or staged, the truth remained. Pol Pot never faced justice. He left behind no testimony, no confessions, no reckoning, only silence. In Cambodia, the news struck like a stone thrown into deep water. Survivors of the killing fields wept not for him, but for the justice denied. Monks lit incense in memory of the millions who had perished, their chants rising into the night like smoke from a wound that would never close. Families stood in the fields where their loved ones had died, staring at the earth as if waiting for answers that would never come. For them, Pol Pot's quiet death was an insult. He had lived too long and died too isolated. The Cambodian government declared it a missed opportunity. International leaders echoed the sentiment. Historians wrote of the tragedy of unfinished justice. Yet among the common people, the reaction was more complex. Some felt cheated, others relieved. Some feared his ghost would linger, haunting the country with unrest. Others simply shrugged, too weary from decades of suffering to care any longer. Pol Pot was gone, but the scars he left were still raw. In the jungle where his body had burned, the trees stood silent. The earth swallowed his ashes without ceremony. No monument marks his grave. No shrine bears his name. His legacy is not written in temples or palaces, but in the bones of his victims, scattered across Cambodia's killing fields. And yet, his ghost endures, not as a spirit wandering in the forest, but as a memory etched into the national soul. In Phnom Penh, at Tuol Sleng prison, visitors walk through rooms lined with photographs of the condemned. In Chuang Ek, skulls fill glass towers that rise like silent accusations against the sky. Every grave, every scar, every survivor's story is a reminder that Pol Pot's death did not erase him. History remembers. The last breath of Brother Number One was not the end of his reign. It was a reminder that tyranny rarely dies cleanly. Pol Pot slipped away in the shadows, denying justice, leaving behind only questions, doubts, and ghosts. His death was not a victory for his victims, nor a reckoning for his crimes. It was unfinished business, a wound left open. Cambodia continues to live with that wound. The laughter of children in the streets, the chanting of monks in the temples, the bustling markets of Phnom Penh exists alongside the memory of silence, of emptiness, of a nation once forced to live without family, without joy, without life. Pol Pot's ghost lingers in the absence, in the shadows of memory, in the eyes of those who survived. And so the story ends, not with justice, not with redemption, but with silence. The silence of an old man dying in exile. The silence of victims who never saw him punished. The silence of a jungle that swallowed his ashes. History does not always grant closure. Sometimes it leaves us with whispers, with rumors, with ghosts. Until next time, stay safe, and see you in the next history.